I believe there may have also been an accident on the chairlift. And so this was something that was on my mind, thinking, well, are they keeping the lift well maintained? And I have to say, from visiting, the lift is in extremely good condition. Actually, I was actually quite impressed. The cars had all been replaced. They actually looked more modern than what you might see in even a lot of European resorts, and certainly a lot more modern than what you might see in a Japanese resort where they really seem to be ignoring the maintenance. So from this perspective, I can say the lift is actually seemed to be taken care of well, and I didn't feel personally that the lift safety was something of a concern at all. So what you can see here is just starting to come up the second phase of the gondolas. The second phase is where all the good stuff is. On the right hand side you can see the chairlift. It's a slightly strange lift. I think it's really there so that people can go up when there's wind. The second phase gondola is well known for closing, and when you sort of see it here, you kind of understand why. That, snow or lots of wind, can easily see why they might want to close it. So the bowl that I'm looking at, which is beneath the camera and you can see all the tracks in it, is the patrolled bowl. So there's one bowl underneath that's patrolled, and that would be considered safe. By the way, this is my guide, Imran, and we'll meet him again later on. The main bowl is all very good, but what's the most insane thing about Gulmarg is the terrain outside the main bowl. And what you're looking at now is off to the left, or left on the way up, to the gondola, and you can already see that there's about 5 bowls that are easily accessible, not even needing a hike. You could just ski along this ridge and you can drop into them. So this is just on one side, and you actually have the same thing out on the other side, although it needs a small walk. So the terrain is just next level. It's just insane, and it's almost so insane that it's a tiny bit, it's what you need to be scared of. To give you an example, where we're looking at now, that bowl, which this fellow snowboarder that we met is about to go down,
no pressure,
that bowl's technically not in the main bowl, and so that would not be blasted. That you would be going there at your own risk. So this brings me to what is probably the most important part of this video, and something that I want to spend quite a bit of time on, which is mountain safety. Before I visited, so early February, 2 skiers were killed in this bowl here. So there were 2 Polish skiers with 2 local guides, and there was a very large avalanche that went off that ridge. I spoke to quite a few of the local guides about this incident, and there's also a few write-ups online, one from an Australian skier who I'll link in the description. But the stories that I heard roughly go along the lines of that the avalanche risk was high, so there is an avalanche bulletin that you can find on Facebook, and these 2 Polish skiers were with a guide who was skiing on the ridgeline. You'll notice that, at least when I was there, there's a lot of ridgeline skiing, but they were told to go along the ridgeline, not into the bowl. And not only did they drop into the bowl, secondly, apparently they both dropped into the bowl together, and so this triggered the avalanche. It was a very big, weak layer of snow, and what that caused was this, huge avalanche. You can find the actual video of it online as well if you like. So they were buried a meter deep in snow. One of them had the airbag deployed, which didn't help. One of the guides that I spoke to about it said that the guy with the airbag had a broken neck, and the other guy the body was completely black from bruising. So the death is from trauma. Even if you did expect to be able to be dug out of a 1 meter deep avalanche, which is unlikely. Because it's so near the lift, there was actually quite a quick response, from what I'm told. But it would still take half an hour, I think, to really get down there and get them out, even with a big group of people nearby. My understanding that is that even the name of the bowl, Shaggy's Bowl, was named after an Australian guy who died there in 2008. And I think this brings me to probably the biggest decision that you need to make when you're thinking about going is this place is just incredible, right? You've got a gondola going up to one of the highest points in the world. You've got incredible terrain that's easily accessible, and you have pretty damn good snowfall. And so all those things sound amazing, but then you also need to consider, how am I going to do it safely, right? And there's a few different things that I'm going to go into now to talk about how you can make that safe and why it's a bit different to how you might think about in, say, a European or any other resort. Now, the obvious thing that you're going to do when you want to go ski backcountry to make it safe, or for example, if you're not super experienced in backcountry, is you're going to go and find yourself a guide, and that's my guide in front of me walking with the snowboard. But it's not that straightforward in Gulmarg. Now, that's not because there's a shortage of guides, it's because none of the local guides are qualified. And when I say that, I don't mean necessarily that that's their fault. It's actually, if you think about it, pretty damn hard for them to get qualified. How are they going to get qualified in Kashmir? They'd have to fly overseas, they'd have to do the training and come back, and that's just not going to be practical. So this makes it very difficult because, of course, you want to find a good guide because you want to go ski the mountain safely, but how to know who is a good guide? And, of course, then it comes back to trust or referrals, or such and such referred this person. From my observation, there seem to be a range of guides, and I'll try and explain that. So at the sort of bottom end, and again, not sort of trying to mean this in a demeaning way at all, but at the bottom end, you had guides like the fellow I had, Imran, who really are knowledgeable about the mountain. They've probably been taught by someone else who was a guide, but they are not formally trained. And my hunch is that the majority of these guides are getting some kind of sort of morning briefing, or maybe morning WhatsApp message saying, hey, this is what's safe, this is what's not, and they're roughly just following that. I think it's likely that some of these guides also have had avalanche training, so you'd think that they would know how to find, use a beacon, shovel and probe, and dig someone out. But I don't know about if they would have much experience with actual looking at snowpacks and understanding different aspects, which is really what you'd want to be analyzing the mountain before making a call. And just to be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with this type of guiding. I just think it's super important that people know what they're getting into. The guide that I had, which again, Imran, we had an awesome time together, really enjoyable, and you get what you pay for. The price was, I think it was all included in the package. This would probably be $20 a day, and I think it's better to think of these type of guides less as ski guides in the type of guiding that you might be familiar with in European resorts or American resorts, and more like ski buddies, right? They're going to help you out on the mountain. They're going to show you where to go. They'll probably take you down some of the safer routes. I don't think they will want to take any chances, and I think it's probably a good thing because they're not really qualified, in my opinion, and it's really up to you if that's a risk that you'd want to take. So on the cheaper end, you've got what I call ski buddy guides, and it's just important that you're aware that that's what you're getting, and especially if you're booking through a package, again, just be aware of which guide you're going to get. Now, I'm going to tell you a kind of funny story. about my guide. So I rocked up, and my guide met me at the hotel. He was there on time. Went, got the first lift together, and we did a couple of runs, and it was all good. And I think a couple of runs in, we're on the gondola, and he opens up his backpack. And when I first met him, I checked his transceiver. So I'd done a beep test and just checked that he actually had a transceiver on, and he had a backpack. So I'd assumed that in the backpack there would be a shovel and a probe. But he opened up his bag on the way up one of the lifts, and there was nothing inside it. And so I said to him, "Hang on, you got a transceiver, but where's your shovel and your probe?" And he said, "Oh no, don't worry, brother. You don't need it. You don't need the shovel and the probe. I can dig you out." And so I was like, dig me out with what? Like your hands? How are you even going to find me and know where to dig? And so that kind of surprised me a bit, that you had even someone calling themselves a guide. Yes, they had a transceiver, that was a good thing, but they didn't even have a shovel and a probe on them, which, if you think about it, could be pretty scary. Now, I did call him out on this, and I said, look, tomorrow when you show up, you got to have a shovel and a probe, which he did. So he did take that feedback on board, and I think, if I'm honest, he didn't take a shovel and a probe because, in his view, we weren't going to do anything risky. We were only going to go on, like I said, those kind of prescribed routes along the ridge lines. We're going to play it safe, and so why do I need that equipment? But in reality, we were still going out of bounds, right? Like outside that main bowl, and so it just seemed to me kind of strange to even show up without that equipment. And we'll talk a bit about equipment later, because obviously it's very, very challenging for the locals to get hold of equipment. But you would have thought that something like a shovel and a probe could be something that they could find if they'd already got hold of a transceiver. Something that I would say I was very impressed by was that I was traveling with an Avalanche airbag backpack, one of the older style ones, and my gas canister was confiscated, and I couldn't get it back. Very annoying. Don't let that happen. So I had my airbag, but I had no canister, and the package guys who organized the tour for me were able to source me a canister, which I think was, frankly, it would have been hard in any resort. I was super impressed that they were able to do that for me in Gulmarg. Now, kind of moving up the scale in guides, again, this is just from my observations, there are local guides who are a bit more experienced, and they will be a tiny bit more expensive, still nowhere near the prices that you might see for a day's guiding outside of Kashmir. And these guys definitely exist. You'd have to do your research to make sure you got the right one. Again, I wouldn't say that these guides are formally qualified, but the way you'd be able to find them is they're most likely good friends with the ski patrol, or even maybe sometimes working with the ski patrol, would probably be a good sign. So I guess for a local guide, if I was going to go back, I would definitely look to find someone with more experience, to just kind of make sure that you're safe on the mountain, and also that you can make the most of the terrain. If you really want to go and try to get what I would maybe call, let's call it European guiding sort of safety level, then I honestly think the only way to do it is to actually go with an overseas guide. One example would be Bill Barker. You can Google that, Bill's Trips, and he's an Australian fellow. And so how that would work is you'd be skiing with Bill or one of Bill's team, and they would also have a local guide. They need to have a local guide with them. And again, whether that really adds much in terms of safety, I don't know. But certainly, that's probably would be the closest you could get to getting guiding anywhere else in the world, and they would be very experienced. Now, the guiding is not the only aspect I think that needs to be considered when you're thinking about mountain safety. The other one that is also not very well discussed, in my opinion, is rescue cover, and how easy it would be to be rescued off the mountain if there's an accident, and after you're rescued, where would you go? Like, which hospital would you go to? Because both of these are a bit more challenging in Gulmarg. So, firstly, from a rescue point of view, whilst the ski patrol seemed to be an excellent team and were quite present on the mountain, that it was still just a team of people, right? I do not think there is a helicopter to to come and rescue, even though there'd be lots of army helicopters, but I doubt that they would get involved. And there's a lot of snowmobiles driving around with tourists on them, but again, I don't know if that would help much. So I do think rescue is something you really got to think about here. That if you get an injury, get into trouble somewhere, then I do not think rescue would be anywhere near as easy as you might see in other resorts. And so this is definitely something that, a risk factor that needs to be considered. And for me, certainly, what it would mean is I would probably ski slightly more tame than I normally would, just because I just don't think you'd want to be, having an injury and trying to get taken off the mountain. The second thing I think is worth thinking about is where would you go if you're injured? There is a hospital in Srinagar, but from what everyone told me, it is not a hospital that you would want to visit. One of the guides told me a story whereby he took 24 hours to rescue someone off the mountain because they were obviously fairly far away. And once they got to the hospital, the lady he was with needed a splint for her back, and they didn't have it. So the hospital just doesn't sound very well equipped. So even if you were to get there, which means that most likely, if you are in serious trouble, you're probably going to be trying to get to Delhi, or maybe even outside of India to somewhere like Singapore. I don't know, but it's definitely something to consider, that if you did have a serious injury, that you got to get off the mountain, one, and two, you got to get to hospital. And I think both of those are going to be much more challenging than a lot of other resorts. And so something you need to be aware of before you go on this trip, that's definitely a sort of elevated risk that you just need to accept. Now, I visited reasonably late in the season, so early March, but as you can see, I had excellent snow. Like, it was every day fresh lines, snowing at night, actually snowing nothing like what was forecast. So that's something to keep in mind, that we had good snow and it wasn't really forecast. But the time of year is certainly something that you want to consider, because I would say it's a reasonably small window for the season from what I've read. I probably went a little late, but from what I heard, the season that I went in 2023 was not an epic season, and they did have a lot of problems with the snowpack stability compared to other years where I've heard that actually a lot of the bowls were sort of considered safer to go in. But what I would probably recommend is going a bit earlier in the season and going for at least 2 weeks, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that phase 2 gondola that we looked at earlier is often closed, so you kind of have to just expect that to happen. And if you go earlier in the season, the advantage is that there's actually still a lot of skiing to be had on the phase 1 gondola, and even below the phase 1 gondola you can go down to Tanmarg. So when it's cold enough, which it wasn't when I was there, the snow was actually pretty heavy when you weren't at the top, the ski area is substantially larger, and I would also probably go as far as saying safer, right? In that there's a huge amount of terrain even below phase 2. It's mostly tree skiing, and so that could be something that's a good reason to go a tiny bit earlier in the season. And as I said, I wouldn't go for less than 2 weeks. One of the things you probably read a lot about before you go is the problems with queuing in the gondolas. This does seem to be a very real problem. In this video here, you can see I'm actually going up phase 1, A lot of people choose not to go up it and pull sledges up instead. But the queuing is definitely a problem from what I've heard, and you do need to be, first of all, prepared that it's likely to happen. I mean, there's a few things you can do to avoid it. It bizarrely does seem that certain guides have a sort of a special pass, if you will, to get to sort of queue jump. Um, and remember that the majority of people using the gondola are not skiers. I would say there's probably 10% skiers, and the rest are actually just tourists who just want to see snow and see the views from top of the mountain. So you've got a bit of a kind of mess, if you will, which is you've got some skiers, you've got a lot of tourists, and again, being polite, queuing is not a thing in India. You just don't, people don't queue. The culture there is if there's a space, I'll go for it. And so I have heard kind of horror stories whereby it's taken 2 hours to get up the gondola. Um, and so I think that's something basically just to be prepared that it could happen. When I arrived, the gondola was open every day, and I think the most I would have ever had to queue may have been 15 minutes. But people who were there did tell me that previous days it was either completely closed, or because it'd been closed for a few days, by the time it reopened, it was almost impossible to get up. There's nothing you can really do about this, and it's another good reason to go for at least 2 weeks in case this happens. Maybe in the future they might implement something whereby the skiers
How
pay
was it,
more.
guys?
I mean, the lift pass is dirt
Good?
cheap anyway, and
Full
by
day?
paying more, maybe you get some kind
Enough
of
powder?
VIP queuing, which would make a lot of sense. The two guys that you can see here are my guide and another fellow that I met on the mountain called Drew. Now, this kind of brings us something which I think is really unique to Gulmarg and Kashmir in general, which is the friendliness of the people. And I know that it's common for people to say, "Oh, I visited this place and everyone was so friendly," but I don't think I've ever been to a place where the locals are just so friendly and genuinely want to help you and actually want to spend time with you. Because it's such a small community and relatively small number of skiers going there, I think what this creates is a really special environment where they kind of everyone who visits is welcome, and they really want to make sure that you have a good trip and that you potentially come back. To give you an example, on my first day, I met a couple up the mountain who invited me to meet them for a drink later, and I met them along with all of their friends and ended up spending the entire evening together, getting to know them, which I just don't think would happen anywhere else apart from somewhere like